The Wyoming night had swallowed the road whole. Garrett Wolf McRae leaned into the Harley's handlebars, squinting through ice-crusted goggles at what used to be Interstate 80. The white line that separated asphalt from shoulder had disappeared an hour ago. Now there was only wind snow moving sideways in sheets and the kind of cold that turned breath to frost before it left a man's lungs. 23 miles west of Laramie, the temperature gauge on a passing truck had read -8. That was before the truck vanished into the white wall, a head taillight swallowed like coins dropped into deep water. Garrett's hands ached inside his leather gloves. His beard had frozen into something that felt more like wire than hair. The patch on the back of his jacket faded, but still visible, marked him as what he'd been for 40 years. A rider, a brother, a man who trusted his machine more than he trusted most people. But tonight, trust didn't matter. The storm was winning. He eased off the throttle, feeling the rear tire slip, catch, then slip again. Ice beneath the snow. The Harley shuddered, and for one breath, Garrett felt the road tilt under him like the deck of a ship in rough water. He didn't pray. He'd stopped praying 9 years ago, but he did think about Lorelei. She would have loved this, he thought. His wife had always said silence had a color, and for her it was white. Pure, complete, endless white. The kind of quiet that only a woman born deaf could understand. The kind of quiet that didn't ask questions or demand answers. It just was. Lorelei had been gone 4 years now. Cancer had taken her in stages piece by piece until all that remained was a hospital bed and hands too weak to sign goodnight. Garrett had held those hands at the end, and when they finally went still, he'd understood for the first time what real silence felt like. It wasn't white, it was black. A gust of wind hit him broadside and the Harley lurched. Garrett's boot came down hard on pavement. He couldn't see, steadying the bike by instinct and 40 years of muscle memory. His heart hammered against his ribs. Stupid old man, he thought. Riding in this. Lorelei would have called him 10 kinds of fool. But staying home hadn't been an option. Staying home meant sitting in the house they'd bought together, walking past the chair where she used to read, seeing her coffee mug still on the second shelf because he couldn't bring himself to move it. Staying home meant thinking, and thinking led to remembering. And remembering led to Nessa. Garrett pushed the thought away, but it came back the way it always did, slow, heavy, unavoidable. His niece, 9 years old, dark hair and braids, a smile that could light up a room until the day it couldn't anymore. He'd been at her birthday party. Streamers, balloons, a magician hired to pull rabbits out of hats. Garrett had stood near the punch bowl watching the kids scream and laugh, and then he'd seen it. Nessa standing near the hallway, her stepfather Mike looming behind her, and Nessa's hands small and quick, signing something Garrett almost missed. "Uncle Wolf, I'm scared." Lorelei had taught him American Sign Language when they first started dating. She'd been patient, correcting his clumsy fingers until he could hold a conversation without stumbling. By the time they married, Garrett could sign as naturally as he could speak. So when Nessa signed those 3 words, he understood them perfectly. He just didn't believe them. She's scared of the magician, he'd thought. Kids get nervous around strangers in costumes. It's nothing. He'd waved at her, smiled, turned back to his conversation. 3 weeks later, Nessa was dead. The police report said suicide. Hung herself with a belt in the garage while her mother was at the grocery store. No note, no explanation, just a 9-year-old girl who decided she couldn't live in her own skin anymore. Except there had been a note. Garrett found it later tucked inside the sympathy card Nessa's mother sent him. A single piece of notebook paper folded 3 times with 7 words in a child's handwriting. Nobody listened. "I'm too broken to fix." He kept that note in his wallet, had kept it for 9 years. Some nights he took it out and read it until the words blurred. Other nights, he didn't need to take it out at all. He knew every loop of every letter by heart. The investigation that followed Nessa's death uncovered what Garrett should have seen. Mike, the stepfather, had been abusing her for months. Physical, emotional, relentless. And Nessa had tried to tell people. She'd tried to tell her mother, her teacher, her school counselor. She'd tried to tell her Uncle Wolf. But nobody had listened to the silent scream of a little girl who only knew how to ask for help with her hands. Garrett's throat tightened. He blinked hard, ice cracking at the corners of his eyes. 9 years, and the guilt still sat on his chest like a stone. The Harley's headlight caught something ahead. A shape boxy and dark against the white. Garrett eased off the throttle, squinting. A sign. Maeve's Mile 312 diner, it read. 0.2 miles, open 24 hours. He hadn't planned on stopping. Hadn't planned on anything except riding until the storm passed or the gas ran out, whichever came first. But his hands were numb now, and the wind was howling like something alive, and the truth was he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him anymore. Lorelai's voice soft and clear in his memory. Don't be a stubborn fool, Wolf. Take the help when it's offered. He turned the Harley toward the exit. The diner sat alone in a pool of yellow light, small and square, and defiant against the storm. The parking lot had 3 vehicles, 2 18-wheelers pulled off to the side, and a silver SUV with its engine still running, exhaust drifting into the dark. Garrett killed the Harley's engine and sat for a moment letting the silence settle. His legs felt like wood when he swung them off the bike. Ice cracked and fell from his jacket as he stood, and the wind hit him so hard he had to grab the handlebars to stay upright. He looked at the diner windows. Warm light inside. People moving, safety, and something else. He couldn't name it yet, but it was there. A prickling at the back of his neck. The same feeling he used to get riding through bad neighborhoods late when the air felt wrong, and his instincts whispered turn around. Garrett pulled off his goggles and tucked them into his saddlebag. His hands were shaking. From the cold, he told himself. Just the cold. He pushed through the diner door and the warmth hit him like a wall. Inside, the world stopped for half a breath. 7 faces turned toward him. A woman behind the counter, mid-60s gray hair pulled back in a bun. 2 truckers in a corner booth, flannel shirts and ball caps. An elderly couple near the window, holding hands across a table, scattered with empty sugar packets. And in the last booth, closest to the back, a woman in a tan coat sitting across from a little girl in a purple parka. Garrett knew what they saw when they looked at him. 6'3", shoulders like a barn door gray, streaking through his beard in lines that made him look older than 63. The Hells Angels patch on his back faded but unmistakable. Scars on his knuckles. Ice in his beard. Leather creaking as he moved. Trouble, they thought. Trouble just walked in. He was used to it, too. The woman behind the counter recovered first. She set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and nodded once, the kind of nod that said, I don't care what you look like, you're a customer. Garrett nodded back. He crossed to the counter boots, leaving wet prints on the tile, and eased himself onto a stool near the coffee pot. The warmth was almost painful. His fingers tingled as blood started moving again. The woman came over, wiping her hands on her apron. Her name tag said Maeve. Rough night, she said. Her voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that had talked a lot of people through a lot of long shifts. Yes, ma'am, Garrett said. Coffee. Please. She poured without asking how he took it. Black, strong, hot enough to burn. Garrett wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat soak into his palms. Roads are closed westbound, Maeve said, setting the pot back on the burner. County just called. Nobody's getting through tonight. Garrett nodded. He'd figured as much. You're welcome to wait it out here, Maeve continued. Got pie if you're hungry. Soup's gone, but I can make a sandwich. Coffee's fine for now, Garrett said. Thank you. Maeve studied him for a moment, the way someone who'd spent 30 years serving strangers could read a person in 3 seconds. Whatever she saw, she seemed satisfied. She moved down the counter, refilling mugs for the truckers, asking the elderly couple if they needed anything else. Garrett took a sip of coffee and let his eyes drift. The diner was small, 10 booths a counter with 8 stools, a pie case that looked older than Garrett, and a swinging door that led to the kitchen. The walls were decorated with faded Wyoming landscapes and black and white photos of the interstate under construction. A radio behind the counter played low-some country station, giving weather updates nobody needed to hear. The 2 truckers were talking quietly, glancing at the windows every few seconds. The storm worried them. Garrett could see it in the way they kept checking their phones, probably calling dispatch, trying to figure out how long they'd be stuck here. The elderly couple wasn't talking at all. They just sat, hands folded together, looking out at the snow with the patience of people who'd weathered 100 storms and knew they'd weather 100 more. And then there was the woman and the little girl. Garrett's eyes settled on them, and that prickling feeling at the back of his neck came back sharper this time. The woman was maybe 43, neat hair, tan coat, buttoned all the way up, even though the diner was warm. She had a purse on the seat beside her, expensive looking, and her hands were folded on the table in a way that looked calm but felt practiced. The little girl sat across from her, small enough that the purple parka swallowed her shoulders. Her hair was dark blonde, tucked under a knit hat that didn't fit quite right. One hand rested on the table, and Garrett could see a gray glove with a hole in the index finger. The girl's face was pale, not from cold, from something else. Garrett knew fear when he saw it. He'd seen it in war zones in men who just walked away from motorcycle wrecks, in women leaving bad marriages. He'd seen it in his own reflection after Nessa died. This little girl was afraid. Her eyes were wide blue-gray, fixed on the table in front of her. She wasn't moving, wasn't fidgeting the way kids usually did when they were bored or restless. She sat perfectly still, the way animals sat still when predators were near. The woman leaned forward, smiling, and said something Garrett couldn't hear. The little girl didn't respond, didn't look up, didn't nod. She just sat there frozen. Garrett's chest tightened. He turned back to his coffee, forcing himself to look casual. But his eyes drifted to the mirror behind the pie case, the one Maeve probably used to watch the whole diner without turning around. In the mirror, he could see the little girl's reflection. And then he saw her hand move. It was slow, deliberate, hidden beneath the edge of the table where the woman couldn't see. The little girl's fingers trembled, but the signs were unmistakable. Not my mom. Garrett's heart stopped. He stared at the mirror, barely breathing, waiting to see if he'd imagined he might. The little girl's hand moved again. Help. The coffee mug slipped in Garrett's grip. He caught it before it fell, but his pulse was hammering now loud in his ears. American Sign Language. This little girl knew ASL, and she was asking for help. Garrett's mind raced. He looked at the woman again, at the way she smiled, the way her hands stayed visible, calm, unthreatening. She looked like a mother. She looked like someone taking care of a tired child on a long drive. But the little girl's sign said otherwise. Not my mom. Garrett thought about Nessa, about the birthday party, about the moment he'd seen her sign Uncle Wolf. I'm scared, and he'd turned away. He thought about the note in his wallet. Nobody listened. His hands were shaking again, and this time it wasn't from the cold. He set the mug down carefully, keeping his movements slow, and lifted his eyes to the mirror. The little girl was looking at him now. Not directly, but through the reflection, her gaze meeting his across the glass. Her eyes were desperate. Garrett swallowed hard. He couldn't speak, couldn't shout, couldn't do anything that would spook the woman or put the child in more danger. But he could sign. He lowered his right hand just above the counter, where only the girl could see it in the mirror, and shaped the words as carefully as his stiff fingers would allow. Are you safe? The little girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her chin trembled once, and then she gave the smallest answer in the world. No. Garrett kept his face as still as winter stone. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to stand up, to grab the little girl and get her out of there. But he knew better. Panic got people hurt. Panic got kids killed. He took a slow breath, picked up his coffee mug, and took a sip he didn't taste. In the mirror, the woman in the tan coat turned back toward the booth, one hand resting on the little girl's shoulder. The touch looked gentle from across the room, but the little girl flinched, curling inward like paper too close to a flame. Garrett noticed everything now. The purple parka was zipped crooked as if someone else had closed it in a hurry. The girl's boots were wet up to the ankle, dark with something that wasn't snow. Garrett had grown up in Wyoming. He knew mud when he saw it. Red clay mud, the kind that came from the flats east of Rawlins, not from the paved parking lot outside. The woman's boots, by contrast, were almost clean. Just fresh snow on the soles. They hadn't come from the same place. Garrett's jaw tightened. The little girl had a small smear of red dirt near one cuff of her parka. The woman had none. And there was something else. The way the woman's eyes kept darting to the windows. The way her fingers drummed once against the table, then stopped as if she'd caught herself showing nerves. Maeve came by with the coffee pot, and Garrett didn't look away from his mug. Rough night, she said again, filling his cup. Roads closed. Garrett said, his voice low and even. If the county has any sense. They do, Maeve said. For once, Garrett paused, then asked, you still got that landline behind the counter? Maeve's hand stopped mid-pour for less than a second. She'd been running this diner for 31 years. She knew the difference between small talk and a warning. Sure do, she said. Line's working so far. Garrett nodded once. Maeve moved on pouring coffee for the truckers, but Garrett saw the way her eyes flicked toward the last booth. She'd noticed something too. Maybe not the signs, but the tension, the wrongness. Garrett pulled his phone from his jacket and kept it below the counter, shielded by one broad hand. His fingers moved carefully across the screen, typing a message to Silas Doc Huxley, a man he'd ridden with for 20 years. A man who'd worked emergency calls in weather just like this. Possible 207. Maeve's Diner, mile 312. Send riders. Silent approach. He hit send and erased the screen with his palm, setting the phone face down beside his mug. The woman was watching him now. Garrett felt her eyes on the side of his face, but he didn't turn. He kept his gaze on his coffee, his posture relaxed like a man who'd only stopped because the storm had forced him to. The woman stood up, smoothing her coat. Her smile came back too quickly, too neatly, like a curtain pulled over a broken window. "Big storm out there," she said, her voice pleasant, conversational, as if they were neighbors passing time in line at a grocery store. Garrett turned halfway on the stool, enough to be polite, not enough to corner her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My daughter and I were trying to get home before it got worse," she continued. She rested one hand on the little girl's shoulder again and again. The child went rigid. Garrett kept his face neutral. "Roads are already worse. Whiteout past mile marker 315. Trucks are pulling off." "We're used to winter," the woman said. Her smile never wavered. "She just gets nervous around men she doesn't know." The little girl stared at the tabletop, her hands disappearing into her lap. Garrett nodded once, not challenging, not giving the woman a reason to grab the child and run. "Most folks get nervous in weather like this," he said. "No shame in waiting it out." Maeve stepped in, then her voice warm and ordinary, but carrying weight underneath. "I can get the little one some hot chocolate," she said. "On the house." The woman answered before the child could breathe. "She doesn't like sweet things." Garrett watched the little girl's eyes lift, just for a heartbeat, toward the steaming mug Maeve was already holding. There it was again, small, sharp, the truth hiding in a child's silence. The woman's smile tightened at the corners, barely noticeable, but Garrett caught it. She'd seen the girl's reaction too. Garrett's phone buzzed once against the counter. He didn't pick it up right away. He waited until the woman looked back at Maeve, then tilted the screen just enough to read the message from Doc. Mercer notified. "Missing child report, out of Rollins. Need name if possible." Garrett's pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Panic wasted motion. Fear made noise. A child in trouble needed calm more than thunder. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a pair of dry leather gloves, and set them on the counter where the girl could see them in the mirror. Then he signed low, one careful word at a time. Name the little girl swallowed hard. Her fingers barely rose above her lap. "Ruby." Garrett repeated it silently in his mind, anchoring her to something real. Ruby. Not a problem, not a scene, not a stranger's claim. A child with a name sitting 20 feet away in a snowbound diner, waiting for one adult to believe her, before the storm took the choice away. The name changed the room for Garrett, though nobody else knew it yet. Ruby. 2 syllables, small enough to fit inside a whisper, heavy enough to turn a snowbound diner into the edge of something that mattered. Garrett didn't look at her too long. He knew children notice pressure the way deer notice broken branches. Instead, he lifted his mug, let the coffee steam fog the lower half of his face, and watched the woman in the tan coat through the mirror. She was good at pretending. That was the part that made Garrett colder than the storm outside. She didn't fidget. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look like the kind of person strangers would question. Her hair was neatly brushed. Her coat was buttoned straight. And when she smiled at Maeve, she looked tired, maybe a little embarrassed by a difficult child, but not dangerous. That was how people walked past trouble every day. They waited for danger to look like danger, and when it arrived wearing clean gloves and a polite voice, they made excuses for it. "Actually," the woman said, sliding from the booth with her purse tucked under one arm, "we should go before the highway shuts down completely." Ruby's shoulders tightened. Garrett saw it in the mirror. A movement so small most folks would have mistaken it for a shiver. Maeve set the hot chocolate on the counter instead of carrying it to the booth. "County plows haven't come through in over an hour," she said. "You're welcome to wait here. Heat's working and I've got soup left." "That's kind," the woman replied, still smiling. "But my daughter has a medical routine. She doesn't do well away from home." Garrett turned slightly. "What's her name?" he asked. The woman blinked once, not much, just once. "Madison," she said. "We call her Ruby." It was the right answer, but it came half a beat too late. Garrett felt the room narrow around that pause. "Pretty name," he said. How old? 9, the woman answered. In the mirror, Ruby's hand moved against her coat. 8, Garrett kept breathing slow. Hard age, he said. Old enough to know what she wants, young enough to still need someone listening. The woman's smile thinned. You seem very interested in my child. Garrett McCrae, Garrett said. Folks call me Wolf. Well, Mr. McCrae, the woman said, her tone still calm, still reasonable. My daughter has been through a long day. She's shy. I'd appreciate it if you didn't make her more uncomfortable. Her words were reasonable. Her tone was calm. That was exactly why Garrett didn't trust them. A person telling the truth usually left room for the child to exist. This woman filled every space before Ruby could enter it. Maeve moved behind the counter, slow and ordinary, but Garrett saw her hand reach for the phone mounted near the swinging kitchen door. Good. Witnesses, records, time. Those were better than anger. Garrett glanced toward the window. The woman's silver SUV sat under the buzzing lot light, its rear tires packed with snow, its engine still running, exhaust drifting sideways and vanishing into the dark. Nobody kept a vehicle running that long unless leaving fast mattered more than fuel. His phone buzzed again. This time he turned it under his palm and read the message from Doc. Sheriff says missing girl is 8. Mother is Delilah Hartwell. Child knows ASL. Silver vehicle reported near clinic. Do not let them leave if safe. Garrett set the phone down and felt the old world inside him reach for a louder solution. The kind men expected from someone with his patch. He pushed it away. Ruby didn't need thunder. She needed a door that stayed open long enough for help to walk through. The woman reached for Ruby's backpack on the booth seat. Come on, sweetheart. Ruby didn't move. The woman bent closer, voice soft but tight around the edges. Tell the nice people we're fine. Garrett stood then, not fast, not threatening, just enough that the room understood the weather had shifted. Snow rattled against the windows. The coffee machine hissed. Maeve held the phone to her ear. Garrett kept his hands open at his sides and looked only at the woman. Ma'am, he said, quiet as falling ash, no child is leaving this diner in that storm until the sheriff says the road is safe. For one breath, the diner became quieter than the snow. Garrett had not raised his voice, but his words landed with the weight of a closed gate. Maeve stood behind the counter with the phone pressed to her ear, her eyes fixed on the woman in the tan coat. The 2 truckers near the front window stopped stirring their coffee. The elderly couple in the corner looked down at their plates, then slowly back up, understanding that something important was happening, but not yet knowing its shape. The woman straightened her fingers, tightening around the strap of Ruby's backpack. That's not your decision, she said. You don't get to tell me what I can do with my daughter. You're right, Garrett answered. That's the sheriff's decision. Roads are closed and there's a child involved. He kept his hands open, palms visible, every movement slow enough for Ruby to follow. He wasn't standing between the woman and the door like a threat. He was standing beside the counter like a man who knew the rules and had decided to respect them, even when fear begged him not to. The woman gave a small laugh, the kind meant to make everyone else feel foolish. This is ridiculous. She's tired. She's cold. She needs to be home. Ruby's eyes stayed on Garrett. He saw the question in them. Will you still believe me if she sounds normal? That question hurt more than he expected. Too many children learned early that adults trusted confidence over truth volume, over fear, clean coats over shaking hands. Garrett turned just enough to speak toward Maeve without taking his attention off the woman. What did dispatch say, Sham? Maeve swallowed. Sheriff Shepard is on his way. He said nobody should drive westbound until county clears the route. The woman's face changed then. It was quick, almost invisible, but Garrett caught it. Not panic, calculation. Her gaze moved to the windows, then to the door, then to the keys in her hand. Outside, the silver SUV idled beneath the lot light, its windshield already frosting at the edges. The storm had thickened, turning the world beyond the glass into a spinning white tunnel. A siren would be useless out there. Headlights vanished after 50 yards. A person could drive into a ditch and disappear before anyone saw brake lights. Garrett's phone buzzed again, and this time Doc's name lit the screen. He answered without lifting it high. Wolf. Doc's voice came rough through static and wind. I'm with Shepard on the radio. Missing report confirmed. Mother's name is Delilah Hartwell. She's been looking for her daughter since late afternoon. Deputy found the child's hat near the clinic lot in Rawlins. Garrett closed his eyes for half a second, not from surprise, from the effort it took to keep all the anger in his chest from becoming something Ruby could see. How far out is Shepard? 10 minutes if the road holds. Maybe 15. I've got riders staged at the fairground. We've got trucks, chains, blankets, radios. Say the word, we move quiet. Garrett looked at Ruby's torn glove, at the way her fingers curled around the edge of the booth, like she was holding herself in place by will alone. Move quiet, he said. This is about keeping her safe. He ended the call as the woman stepped closer to Ruby. Get up, she said, still soft enough that a stranger might call it motherly. Now. Ruby's lower lip trembled, but she didn't stand. The woman reached for her sleeve. Garrett didn't move toward them. Instead, he lowered himself slowly to one knee in the open space between the counter and the booth, far enough away to give Ruby room, low enough that he was no longer towering over anyone. The whole diner watched as the big man in the ice-crusted leather jacket lifted both hands and signed with careful, clumsy tenderness. Do you want help? Ruby stared at him. The woman froze. The storm beat against the windows like 1,000 fists of wind, but inside every sound seemed to wait for the child's answer. Ruby raised her shaking hands, and this time she did not hide them under the table. Please. Then after a breath that seemed to crack something open in the room, she added 2 more signs. My mom is Delilah. Ruby's hands dropped into her lap as if the truth had taken all the strength out of her. For a moment, nobody moved. Maeve's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. The 2 truckers sat straighter in their booth. The elderly couple in the corner held hands across the table without saying a word. Garrett stayed on one knee, breathing slow, keeping his body small in a room that had suddenly become too full of fear. He didn't reach for Ruby. He didn't tell her she was brave yet. Praise too soon could feel like pressure to a child still standing in the middle of danger. Instead, he signed the only promise he could make without lying. Stay. Help is coming. The woman in the tan coat let out a thin, disbelieving sound. This is absurd, she said as she's confused. She does this when she's upset. But the room had changed against her. Not with anger, with attention. Everyone was watching now, and the quiet had turned into a kind of shelter. Maeve stepped from behind the counter and placed the untouched hot chocolate on the table near Ruby, far enough away that the child didn't have to take it close enough that she knew it was hers. Nobody has to drink anything they don't want, Maeve said gently, but it's there if you choose. Ruby looked at the cup, then at Maeve, and something in her face softened by a single degree. The woman reached for the backpack again. We're leaving. Garrett rose slowly, still not blocking her path. Sheriff Shepard is on the way, he said. He can sort this out. I don't need a sheriff to tell me how to care for my child. Then he'll confirm that, Garrett said, and you'll be on your way when the road is safe. The answer trapped her because it sounded fair. That was the point. Garrett had learned long ago that calm could be stronger than force. A storm made people reckless. A frightened child made good people emotional. But if he let emotion take the wheel, Ruby would pay for it. His phone buzzed again, this time with a short message from Doc. 2 minutes. Riders near county line. Shepard says keep witnesses inside. Garrett slid the phone away as headlights appeared beyond the windows. Not one pair. Several. At first they looked like stars sinking through the storm, blurred and ghostly in the whiteout. Then more came behind them. Trucks, motorcycles on trailers, snow-dusted vans, big shapes moving slowly with hazard lights blinking amber through the blowing snow. The woman saw them too. Her mouth tightened. What is this? Garrett looked toward the gas as the first riders pulled into the lot. Not roaring, not crowding, not making a show. They moved with winter discipline, parking wide to leave a room for emergency vehicles, engines cutting off one by one until only the wind spoke. Men and women in dark leather climbed out carrying blankets, flashlights, road flares, thermoses, battery packs, and first aid bags. At the center of them walked Silas Doc Huxley, white beard tucked into his scarf, medical kit in one hand, radio in the other. Behind him came Juno Gravel, a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair under a wool cap and the kind of face children trusted before they knew why. Garrett opened the diner door just enough for Doc to step inside, and a blade of cold swept across the floor. Doc didn't look at the woman first. He looked at Ruby. Then he lowered his voice. Evening, sweetheart. My name is Silas. Folks call me Doc. I'm here to make sure everybody stays warm. Juno moved to the counter, asked Maeve for permission with her eyes, then sat 2 stools away from Ruby's booth, giving the child space. Outside, more headlights gathered in careful rows. Not an army, not a threat. A wall of witnesses. A net of light in a storm that had almost swallowed one little girl whole. Then through the radio, on Doc's shoulder, Sheriff Boone Shepard's voice crackled clear and close. "Wolf, this is Shepard. I'm entering the lot now. Keep everyone calm. Delilah Hartwell is with us." Ruby heard her mother's name and made a sound so small it nearly broke Garrett's heart. Outside, red and blue lights cut through the falling snow. The woman in the tan coat looked toward the back exit. Garrett saw it, so did Maeve, so did every person in that diner who had finally learned the difference between watching and paying attention. The back exit was nothing more than a narrow door beside the restrooms painted the same faded cream as the wall, easy to miss unless someone was looking for a way out. Vivian Cross looked at it for less than a second, but Garrett had spent half his life reading half seconds. Maeve saw it too, and with the calm courage of a woman who had kept truckers fed through blizzards, layoffs, funerals, and lonely holidays, she walked to the hallway and set a yellow mop bucket in front of the door as if she'd only just remembered a spill. "Floor's slick back there," Maeve said, her voice steady. "Nobody should be rushing around." Vivian's eyes narrowed, but before she could answer, red and blue lights washed across the diner windows softened by the snow until they looked like watercolor bleeding through glass. Sheriff Boone Shepard's cruiser rolled into the lot behind a county plow, followed by a second vehicle, a civilian sedan with someone sitting in the passenger seat, someone whose hands were pressed against the window like she was trying to reach through the glass itself. Outside, the riders moved like people who had practiced being useful. They didn't crowd the entrance. They didn't shout. They didn't turn the moment into a spectacle. They made space. Two men in reflective vests guided the plow with flashlights. A woman unloaded wool blankets from the back of a pickup. Another rider carried a box of hand warmers into Maeve's kitchen. Someone set orange cones near the icy curb so the ambulance would have a clear path if it was needed. The sight should have been impossible. Leather patches, snow shovels, thermoses, radios, and quiet order beneath a Wyoming sky gone white. Ruby watched through the window, her face pale and uncertain, because children who had been frightened too long did not trust rescue just because it arrived with lights. Garrett understood that. He crouched near the end of the counter, again far enough away that she didn't feel trapped, and signed slowly, shaping each word with fingers made clumsy by cold and age. "Those people are not here to scare you. They are here to keep the storm outside." Ruby looked from his hands to the window, her eyes wide. Juno Gravel slid a folded blanket across the booth seat without touching Ruby or asking her to be grateful. "Purple's a good color," Juno said softly, nodding at the child's parka. "My granddaughter says it's the color of brave people and grape popsicles." Ruby blinked and the smallest breath of almost laughter moved through her nose. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a crack in the ice. Sheriff Boone Shepard stepped inside with snow on his hat and restraint in every line of his body. He was a lean man in his early 50s, with tired eyes and the kind of voice that could calm a county fair crowd or a frightened witness. He removed his gloves, slowly tucking them into his belt with deliberate care. "Evening, folks," he said. "I need everyone to stay where they are for a minute." Vivian moved first. "Sheriff, thank goodness." Her voice trembled just enough to sound genuine. "This man has been harassing me and my daughter. We're trying to get home, and these people are intimidating us." Shepard didn't look at Garrett. He looked at Ruby. Then he looked at Vivian. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll speak with you. First, I need the child's full name." "Madison Cross," Vivian said quickly. "We call her Ruby." Ruby's hands clenched around the edge of the blanket Juno had given her. Shepard nodded as if writing the answer into his memory. "Date of birth." Vivian hesitated. The pause was small, but it spread across the diner like spilled ink. "She just had a birthday," Vivian said. "With the storm and everything, I'm tired." Shepard's expression didn't change. "That's understandable. We'll verify." Outside, a deputy opened the rear door of the second cruiser. A woman stepped out into the storm wrapped in a borrowed coat, one hand pressed against the vehicle for balance. She looked like someone held upright by love and fear alone. Ruby saw her through the glass and stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Garrett saw the child's whole body lean forward, then freeze as if hope itself had become too dangerous to touch. Vivian saw the woman too. Her polite mask finally slipped. She reached for the backpack on the table. Not toward Ruby this time, but toward the bag. Doc stepped into the aisle with both hands visible. "That bag may have medication or identification," he said calmly. "Best to leave it for the sheriff." Vivian pulled it close anyway. It belongs to us. Then the sheriff can confirm that too, Garrett said. The front door opened again, and the woman's voice entered before she did, broken by cold, breathless, and unmistakably human. Ruby. The little girl's eyes filled, but she didn't run. She looked at Garrett, asking without signs whether it was safe to believe what she was seeing. Garrett swallowed the ache in his throat and signed one word. Choose. Delilah Hartwell stood just inside the diner door with snow melting in her hair and terror still written across her face. But she didn't rush forward. Every instinct in her body begged her to run to her daughter, to grab Ruby and hold on until the whole world stopped shaking. Yet she saw Garrett's hand move and understood the meaning before anyone explained it. Choose. Delilah dropped slowly to her knees on the worn tile floor, keeping several feet between herself and the booth. Her lips trembled, but her hands rose with the care of someone touching glass. I'm here, she signed. You choose. Ruby made a sound that was almost a sob, almost a breath, and then stopped herself. Her eyes moved to Vivian, who still had one hand locked around the backpack. The room seemed to tilt toward that bag. Garrett noticed the way Ruby's gaze followed it, not with attachment, but with fear. Medicine, he asked softly, signing the word as best he could. Ruby nodded, hard tears slipping down her cheeks. Doc Huxley heard the answer without needing more. Sheriff, he said, calm but firm, the child may need something in that backpack. Sheriff Shepard turned to Vivian. Ma'am set the bag on the table. Vivian's smile was gone now. What remained was a tight, bright panic she could no longer polish into manners. This has gone far enough, she said. You're all making a mistake. Then we'll correct it with paperwork, Shepard replied. Set the bag down. Outside, the riders held their positions under the storm lights, not moving closer, not making noise, simply keeping the lot visible and clear. Their discipline made the diner feel steadier, as if the building itself had grown roots. Vivian looked toward the front door, then the back hallway, but Maeve's mop bucket still blocked the rear exit, and two deputies were already stepping inside from the storm. The walls of her story were closing, not because anyone had threatened her, but because the truth had finally been given enough witnesses. Vivian placed the backpack on the table, but as Shepard reached for it, she turned sharply and pushed through the front door into the whiteout. Cold air burst into the diner. Ruby flinched. Delilah whispered her daughter's name, but stayed where she was, honoring the choice she had offered. Garrett didn't chase like a man in a movie. He moved like a man who understood ice fear and bad decisions. Doc, stay with Ruby, he said. Shepard, she's heading for the SUV. The sheriff and deputies went out first. Garrett followed only to the porch, stopping beneath the overhang, where the wind slapped snow against his face. Vivian reached the silver vehicle, started it, and pulled away too fast for the conditions. The tires spun, caught, then slid sideways toward the edge of the lot. For one breath, the taillights smeared red across the storm. Then the vehicle eased into a shallow snowbank beside the access road, tilted, but still upright, its engine coughing under the wind. Nobody cheered, nobody laughed, nobody rushed with anger. The riders moved with purpose. Flashlights lifted. A tow strap came from a pickup. A deputy called for Vivian to stay seated until the vehicle was stable. Garrett watched as two riders in reflective vests guided the sheriff safely across the icy lot, their boots careful, their hands open. It was not revenge, it was rescue. Even for the person who had caused the fear. That was what Ruby needed to see. That was what every child needed to learn. Good people did not become cruel just because someone else had done wrong. Inside, Juno wrapped the blanket a little closer around Ruby without touching her shoulders. They'll handle it, she said. You're not in trouble. Delilah's hands rose again. I love you, she signed. I am not mad. I am here. Ruby stared at her mother as if those words had to travel through miles of snow before they could reach her. Then she slid out of the booth, slow and uncertain, one foot touching the floor, then the other. Garrett stepped back from the doorway, giving her a clear path. The little girl walked past the untouched hot chocolate, past the backpack on the table, past all the grown-ups, waiting in silence, and stopped an arm's length from Delilah. For a second, she only looked. Then Ruby lifted her shaking hands and signed, You came. Delilah broke then, but softly, with her arms still open and still waiting. Always, she signed back. Only then did Ruby step into her mother's coat, and the storm outside seemed for the first time all night a little farther away. Garrett turned away from the reunion, giving them privacy, and found himself facing the window again. Outside, Shepard and his deputies were helping Vivian from the SUV. She wasn't fighting, wasn't screaming. She moved like someone waking from a dream they couldn't quite remember, confused and broken and utterly lost. One of the deputies draped a blanket around her shoulders. Garrett felt something twist in his chest. 9 years ago, he'd wanted someone to blame for Nessa's death. He'd wanted Mike, the stepfather, to suffer the way Nessa had suffered. He'd wanted justice to feel like vengeance. But standing here now, watching Vivian Cross stumble through the snow, with that blank, shattered look on her face, Garrett understood something he hadn't understood before. Cruelty wouldn't have saved Nessa, and it wouldn't save anyone else. What saved people was what he was watching right now. Patience, witnesses, adults who believed children when they asked for help, and maybe sometimes a little mercy for the broken people who did terrible things because they didn't know how to heal. Sheriff Shepard came back inside 15 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots and pulling off his gloves. He crossed to where Garrett stood and spoke quietly. "Vivian Cross is heading to County General now," Shepard said. "Psychiatric hold. 72 hours minimum." Garrett nodded. "She say anything, sir?" Shepard's face darkened. "More than I expected. Vivian had been planning this for months. We found a journal in her car, pages of notes about Ruby's schedule routes from school, the clinic's layout. She'd been tracking Ruby since she was fired." He paused. "And there were 3 other names, 3 other 8-year-old girls who looked like her daughter Iris. We just stopped a serial kidnapping before it escalated." Garrett's hands tightened around his coffee mug. Ruby wasn't just one child saved. She was the first domino that prevented 3 more tragedies. "Does Delilah know?" "Not yet. I'll tell her tomorrow. Tonight she just needs to hold her daughter." Shepard looked at Garrett for a long moment. "Doc Huxley told me about your niece," he said. "About what happened 9 years ago." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Nessa," he said. "Her name was Nessa." "Nessa," Shepard repeated, as if committing it to memory. "What happened to her shouldn't have happened. But what you did tonight." He gestured toward the booth where Ruby sat wrapped in blankets, Delilah's arms around her. "That matters. You know that, right?" Garrett didn't answer. He couldn't, because he didn't know if it mattered enough to balance the scales. Didn't know if saving one child could ever make up for failing another. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just to keep trying. Sheriff Shepard made the call at 11:43. The diner would serve as an emergency shelter until dawn or until conditions improved, whichever came first. Maeve didn't blink. She'd weathered worse. She fired up the grill, pulled sandwich fixings from the walk-in cooler, and started brewing coffee by the gallon. The 2 truckers, Hank and Dale, offered to help. Within 20 minutes, they'd pushed tables together to make space, carried in extra blankets from the sleeper cabs of their rigs, and set up a charging station for phones near the one working outlet by the restrooms. The elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, sat quietly in their corner booth, holding hands and watching the snow, with the calm of people who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. And the riders kept coming. Not all 270 at once. That would have overwhelmed the small diner and the narrow lot. But in waves and shifts, moving with the practiced coordination of people who had done this kind of thing before. Doc Huxley set up a medical station near the kitchen, just a folding table with his kit, and a clipboard for anyone who needed attention. Frostbite checks blood pressure for the elderly, a finger splint for one of the plow drivers who jammed his hand against the blade controls. Juno Gravel worked the room like a shepherd, not pushing, just noticing. She brought a pillow to Mrs. Pemberton. She refilled Hank's coffee without asking. She sat 2 booths away from Ruby and Delilah, close enough to help if needed, far enough away to give them space. Garrett stayed at the counter. He didn't know how to be anywhere else. His coffee had gone cold again, but he held the mug anyway, feeling the ceramic grow warm in his hands as Maeve refilled it for the 3rd time. "You did good," Maeve said quietly, setting the pot down. Garrett didn't answer right away. He turned the mug in slow circles, watching the surface ripple. "I didn't do anything a decent person wouldn't do," he said finally. "That's where you are wrong," Maeve replied. "A decent person sees something wrong and thinks someone else will handle it. You didn't wait for someone else." Garrett looked at her then, and for a moment the diner fell away. It was just 2 people who had lived long enough to know that good intentions didn't mean much without action. "I waited once," Garrett said. "A long time ago. I told myself I'd imagined it. Told myself it wasn't my place. Told myself a lot of things that sounded reasonable right up until they weren't." Maeve nodded slowly. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. Well, she said tonight you didn't wait. She moved down the counter, pouring coffee for a rider who'd just come in from directing traffic at the county line, and Garrett was alone again with the weight of what hadn't been said. Ruby's laughter cut through the low hum of conversation. It was small, barely more than a breath, but it turned heads. She was sitting on the floor near the booth now, her back against the seat, the stuffed rabbit in her lap. Delilah sat beside her, not hovering, just present. One of the younger riders, a woman named Cass, who couldn't have been more than 25, had pulled a deck of cards from her jacket and was showing Ruby a simple magic trick. Nothing fancy, just a card vanishing from one hand and appearing in the other. Ruby's eyes went wide. She signed something to Delilah, who translated aloud. "She wants to know how you did it." Cass grinned. "That's the secret. Magicians never tell." Ruby tilted her head, considering this, then signed again. Delilah smiled. "She says you have to tell her because she can't hear, so it's only fair she gets to see the secret." Cass laughed, a bright sound that felt out of place in the heavy night, but somehow fit anyway. "All right," Cass said, "but only because that's the best argument I've ever heard." She showed Ruby the sleight of hand, slow and deliberate, and Ruby watched with the intensity of a child who had learned that details mattered. Garrett turned back to his coffee, but something in his chest had loosened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the first step toward it. Doc Huxley opened the backpack on the table with Sheriff Shepard watching and Delilah giving permission. Inside were a pink inhaler, a small case of allergy tablets, a folded school worksheet with Ruby May Hartwell, written across the top in careful pencil, and one stuffed rabbit with a missing button eye. When Ruby saw the rabbit, her face crumpled. Juno picked it up by one soft ear and held it out, stopping halfway so Ruby could decide whether to take it. Ruby reached with both hands and pulled it against her chest. "That's a good friend," Juno said. Ruby nodded into the rabbit's worn fur. Sheriff Shepard took Delilah's statement in a low voice near the counter. She had brought Ruby to a clinic in Rawlins that afternoon after a mild asthma flare. In the confusion of the weather warnings and a crowded parking lot, Ruby had vanished. Delilah had searched the building, the sidewalks, the lot, then called for help when the snow began falling harder. She had been blaming herself every mile since. Garrett heard enough to understand and looked away before Delilah could see that he understood too well. Guilt was a language he had learned young and never fully forgotten. Maeve brought soup to the booth and placed 3 spoons on the table without saying who had to eat. "Food's here," she said. "No rules attached." Ruby looked at the soup, then at the hot chocolate, now cooler, but still hers. After a long moment, she picked up the mug with both hands. No one clapped. No one made a big thing of it. They let the child have one ordinary choice in a night when too many choices had been taken away. Outside, more riders arrived, and Shepard stepped out to organize them with Doc. They divided the work like neighbors instead of legends. 20 riders with trucks would help the plow escort stranded drivers to the diner. 30 would clear snow from the fuel pumps. Others would carry blankets to a stalled bus 2 miles east, and the rest would keep their headlights pointed down the access road so emergency vehicles could see the turn. Garrett stayed near the window, watching the patches move through the storm in quiet service. People would talk later about how many came, how strange it looked, how frightening it might have seemed at first. But Ruby would remember something else. She would remember that the largest people in the room made them all gentle. She would remember that nobody forced her to speak before she was ready. She would remember that when her hands told the truth, someone listened. Delilah looked over at Garrett, tears still bright in her tired eyes, and signed 2 careful words she had probably learned for her daughter long before this night. "Thank you." Garrett shook his head once, then looked at Ruby, who was peeking over the rim of her mug. He lifted his hands and signed back slowly. She was brave first. Somewhere around midnight, one of the stranded drivers, a young woman maybe 30 years old, approached the booth where Ruby and Delilah sat. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to thank your daughter." Delilah looked up confused. The woman glanced at Ruby, then back at Delilah. "I have a niece. She's 6. She's deaf. And I've been learning ASL, but I'm slow at it, and sometimes I wonder if it's worth all the effort." Her voice cracked. "Watching your daughter tonight, seeing how she communicated when she couldn't speak, seeing how people listened when she used her hands." She wiped her eyes. "I'm never going to wonder again if it's worth it." Delilah's hand found Ruby's shoulder. Would you like to meet her? Delilah asked. The woman nodded and Delilah translated as Ruby signed a simple greeting. Hello, my name is Ruby. Nice to meet you. The woman's face lit up as she signed back clumsy but earnest. Ruby smiled and for the first time all night, it reached her eyes. Garrett watched from the counter and felt the weight on his chest shift just a little bit more. This was what Nessa hadn't gotten. A room full of people who cared enough to pay attention. Adults who believed children even when they couldn't speak. A community that showed up when it mattered. And maybe Garrett thought that was what he could do with the rest of his life. Not erase what happened to Nessa, but make sure it didn't happen to someone else. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, the wind finally began to ease. The snow still fell, but the wild sideways violence of it had passed. Riders rotated in and out, some heading back to their trucks to sleep, others coming in to warm up with coffee and sandwiches. Doc Huxley checked on Ruby twice, listening to her lungs with a stethoscope, making sure the asthma flare Delilah had mentioned wasn't worsening in the stress. Both times, Ruby tolerated the exam without complaint, though she kept one hand on her mother's arm the entire time. Maeve never stopped moving, refilling coffee, wiping tables, restocking napkins, asking if anyone needed anything with the steady calm of a woman who had spent 3 decades turning a roadside diner into a place where people felt human. At some point, Garrett wasn't sure when he realized he'd stopped shaking. Not from the cold, he'd warmed up hours ago, but from the adrenaline, the fear, the crushing weight of what could have gone wrong. Ruby was safe. Delilah had her daughter back. And Vivian Cross, broken and grieving and dangerous, was somewhere she couldn't hurt anyone else. It wasn't a perfect ending. There would be court dates, therapy sessions, trauma that didn't heal overnight. But it was enough. For tonight, it was enough. Around 4 in the morning, Ruby finally fell asleep. She was curled up on the booth seat, her head in Delilah's lap, the stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Delilah had draped a blanket over her and was stroking her hair with the careful, repetitive motion of a mother who couldn't quite believe her child was real. Garrett watched them from across the room and felt something he hadn't felt in 9 years. Not peace exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. Delilah looked up and caught his eye. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Garrett nodded once, then turned back to the window. The storm was breaking. He could feel it in the air, in the way the wind had gentled, in the way the darkness beyond the glass was beginning to pale at the edges. Morning was coming, and with it, the chance to start over. The storm broke just before dawn. It didn't announce itself with fanfare or sudden silence. It simply eased degree by degree until the wind that had been howling for 8 hours became a whisper, and the snow that had fallen in sheets became flurries, and the darkness that had pressed against the windows began to pale around the edges. Garrett stood on the diner's front porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and watched the world emerge from white. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but they were moving now, breaking apart in places to reveal glimpses of something lighter beyond. The parking lot, buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, looked like a photograph from another century. Vehicles sat like sleeping animals beneath their white blankets. The riders' motorcycles, carefully tarped and strapped to trailers, had become abstract sculptures of chrome and canvas. The county plow sat idle near the road, its driver asleep in the cab, waiting for the dispatcher to give the all-clear. Doc Huxley came out and stood beside Garrett, breath fogging in the cold. "Road crews are starting up again," Doc said. "Shepard says they'll have the westbound lane passable by 7, maybe 8. Garrett nodded. "Ruby okay?" "Still sleeping. Delilah, too." Doc took a sip from his own mug. "They'll need follow-up. Medical, psychological. Kid went through hell." "Yeah." They stood in silence, watching the sky lighten. "You know," Doc said after a while, "I've been riding with you for 20 years. Never seen you move like that." Garrett glanced at him. "Like what?" "Like you had something to prove." Garrett looked back at the horizon. "Maybe I did." Doc didn't push. That was one of the things Garrett appreciated about him. Doc knew when to talk and when to let silence do the work. "You planning to stay in touch?" Doc asked eventually. "With Delilah and Ruby." Garrett turned the mug in his hands. "She asked," he said. "Delilah said Ruby could use someone who understands. And, and I don't know." Garrett's voice was rough. "What if I screw it up? What if I'm not what they need?" Doc looked at him, really looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who'd pulled too many people out of wrecks to have patience for self-pity. "Wolf," he said, "you saw a kid in trouble and you didn't look away. You called for help. You kept her safe until that help arrived. That's not screwing up. That's the opposite of screwing up. Garrett's throat tightened. I didn't do that for Nessa. No, Doc agreed. You didn't, and you'll carry that for the rest of your life. But you did it for Ruby, and maybe that's the point. Garrett didn't answer. Doc clapped him once on the shoulder and went back inside, leaving Garrett alone with the dawn and the weight of choices he couldn't undo. Inside, the diner had taken on the quality of a way station between worlds. People slept in booths wrapped in donated blankets, heads pillowed on folded jackets. The two truckers snored in harmony near the window. Mrs. Pemberton dozed with her head on her husband's shoulder, while Mr. Pemberton read a worn paperback by the light of his phone. Maeve moved through the space like a ghost, checking on people refilling. Coffee for those who were awake, keeping the noise to a minimum. Ruby stirred around 6:30, blinking awake, slowly confused for a moment about where she was. Delilah was there immediately, hands gentle on her daughter's face, signing good morning with a smile that was exhausted but real. Ruby sat up clutching her rabbit and looked around the diner as if trying to piece together whether the night before had been real or dream. Her eyes found Garrett at the counter. He nodded once. Ruby nodded back. Then she turned to her mother and signed something Garrett couldn't see. Delilah's face softened. She signed a response, then stood and walked over to where Garrett sat. Ruby wants to know if you're leaving soon, Delilah said. Garrett looked past her to where Ruby sat watching him with those wide blue-gray eyes. Road should be clear in an hour or so, Garrett said. I'll probably head out then. Delilah hesitated, then sat on the stool beside him. She's going to ask if she can see you again, Delilah said quietly. And I want you to know whatever you say is okay. You don't owe us anything. You already gave us everything. Garrett studied his coffee. I'm not good with kids, he said. Never have been. You were good with her. That was different. That was emergency. I knew what to do because I had to. He looked at Delilah. Day-to-day stuff being someone a kid can count on, that's harder. Delilah nodded slowly. I get it, she said. And I meant what I said. No pressure. But Wolf, she trusted you when she couldn't trust anyone else. That matters. And if you're willing even just to check in now and then, I think it would help her remember that the world has people in it worth trusting. Garrett thought about Nessa, about the birthday party, about the moment he turned away. He thought about the note in his wallet. Nobody listened. And then he thought about Ruby's hands shaking but clear signing, please, across the snowbound diner. I can check in, he said, now and then. Delilah's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. Thank you. She stood and went back to Ruby, signing something that made the little girl's face light up. Ruby slid out of the booth and walked over to Garrett, the rabbit tucked under one arm. She stopped a few feet away and lifted her hands. Can I give you something? Garrett nodded. Ruby reached into the pocket of her parka and pulled out a small plastic charm, the kind that came on cheap bracelets. It was purple, star-shaped, scuffed from use. She held it out. Garrett took it carefully, turning it over in his palm. This is yours, he signed, adding. Ruby nodded. Then she signed, now it's yours, so you remember. Remember what? That you saved me, and that I was brave. Garrett's vision blurred. He closed his fist around the charm and nodded. I'll remember, he said aloud, voice breaking. Ruby smiled, small and tired and real, then turned and went back to her mother. Garrett sat there for a long time holding a purple plastic star and trying to breathe around the tightness in his chest. By 7:15, the county plow had finished clearing the westbound lane. Sheriff Shepard came through with updates. The road was passable but not safe for high speeds. Drivers were advised to take it slow, stay in their lanes, and pull off if visibility dropped. The riders began packing up. It happened in the same quiet, organized way they'd arrived. Gear stowed tarps, removed motorcycles, checked and rechecked. Trucks idled to warm up. Riders shook hands, clapped shoulders, spoke in low voices about the next run, the next storm, the next time someone needed help. Juno Gravel stopped by Garrett's stool before she left. Good work, Wolf, she said. Wasn't just me. Never is. She pulled on her gloves. But you made the call. That's what matters. She left, and a few minutes later, Doc Huxley came by to say the same thing in fewer words. One by one, the riders departed until the parking lot was nearly empty again. Just the two 18-wheelers, the Pemberton's sedan, Delilah's car that Sheriff Shepard had arranged to have towed from the clinic lot in Rollins, and Garrett's Harley. Maeve locked the front door at 8 o'clock and flipped the sign to closed. You're all welcome to stay as long as you need, she said to the remaining people. But I'm going to catch a couple hours of sleep before the lunch rush. The Pembertons thanked her and gathered their things, heading out slowly. Mr. Pemberton's arm around his wife's shoulders. Hank and Dale left next, both of them stopping to shake Garrett's hand and mutter something awkward about misjudging him. Garrett waved it off. And then it was just Garrett, Delilah, Ruby, and Maeve. Maeve poured one last cup of coffee and set it in front of Garrett. On the house, she said, for the road. Appreciate it. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd answered a question she hadn't asked. You're a good man, Wolf McCrae, she said. Don't let anyone tell you different. She disappeared into the back, leaving Garrett alone with his coffee and his thoughts. Delilah and Ruby approached a few minutes later, both bundled in their coats, ready to leave. We're going to head out, Delilah said. Sheriff Shepard said he'd follow us back to Rawlins, make sure we get home safe. Garrett stood. You need anything, you call, he said. I'm serious, Delilah smiled. I will. Ruby looked up at him, then carefully, deliberately, she lifted her hands and signed, Thank you, Uncle Wolf. The name hit him like a fist to the chest. Uncle Wolf, the same name Nessa had used, but this time it didn't carry the weight of failure. This time it carried something else. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of forgiveness. Garrett crouched down so he was eye level with Ruby. You were brave, he signed. The bravest person I've ever met. Ruby shook her head. You were brave too. Maybe we both were. So, Garrett ceased and moaned. Ruby smiled, then stepped forward and hugged him quickly, fiercely, before pulling back and taking her mother's hand. Garrett stood and watched them walk out into the snow toward the car where Sheriff Shepard waited. He didn't move until the car pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the road. Then he turned back to the counter, picked up his coffee, and drank it in one long swallow. Garrett McCrae walked out of Maeve's diner at 8:47 in the morning into a world scrubbed clean by snow and wind. The Harley started on the first try, engine rumbling to life with the deep, familiar growl that had been the soundtrack of his adult life. He didn't leave right away. He sat there, hands on the grips, looking at the road ahead. For 9 years, he'd been riding away from something. Away from guilt, away from memory, away from the feeling that he'd failed the one person who'd needed him most. But maybe he thought it was time to start riding towards something instead. He pulled the purple star charm from his pocket and tucked it into the small, zippered pouch on his jacket where he kept Nessa's note. 2 pieces of the same story. One that ended too soon, one that he'd helped continue. Garrett kicked the Harley into gear and pulled out of the lot, heading east toward Laramie, toward home, toward whatever came next. The road was empty and white and endless, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like possibility instead of punishment. 6 months later, on a clear Saturday afternoon in July, Garrett stood in a small park in Rawlins, watching Ruby blow out a single candle on a cake decorated with purple frosting. Delilah had explained on the drive over. Ruby's therapist had suggested celebrating milestones. Ruby had chosen learning to ask for help as hers. When the candle was out, Ruby pulled something from her pocket and handed it to Garrett. It was a second purple star charm, identical to the one she'd given him 6 months ago. She signed, I got a new one. So we match. Garrett looked at the charm, then at Ruby, and felt something break open inside him that had been sealed shut for 9 years. We match, he signed back. Later, as the sun began to set and the party wound down, Garrett found himself sitting on a bench with Delilah while Ruby played with 2 other kids on the nearby climbing structure. She's doing really well, Delilah said. The nightmares have mostly stopped. She's teaching other kids sign language during lunch. Her teacher says she's like a different kid. That's good. It's because of you. Garrett shook his head. It's because of her. And you. Maybe, Delilah said, but you gave her something important, Wolf. You gave her proof that asking for help works, that someone will listen. Garrett watched Ruby climb to the top of the structure, fearless. I had someone ask me for help once, he said quietly, and I didn't listen. I've spent a long time trying to figure out how to live with that. Delilah was quiet for a moment. I don't think you're supposed to live with it, she said finally. I think you're supposed to learn from it and then use what you learn to do better next time. Is that what I'm doing? I think so. She looked at him. I think you took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into the reason you saved my daughter. That's not living with guilt. That's transforming it. Garrett didn't have words for what that meant to him, so he just nodded. And they sat there watching Ruby play as the sky turned orange and gold, and the day slipped into evening. When it was time to leave, Ruby hugged him again longer this time. Then she pulled back and signed, "Will you come back?" Uncle Wolf Garrett looked at Delilah, who nodded. He looked back at Ruby and signed, "Yes, I'll come back." Ruby smiled the kind of smile that could light up a room and ran back to her mother. Garrett walked to his Harley, pulled on his helmet, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. In his pocket, he carried two purple stars. In his wallet, he still carried Nessa's note, but now folded beside it was a new piece of paper. A drawing Ruby had made. It showed two people holding hands, one tall and one small. Above them, in careful letters, Ruby had written Uncle Wolf and me. "We are brave." Garrett looked at it one more time, then tucked it back into his wallet. He started the Harley and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the horizon. The road stretched ahead, long and open and full of light. And somewhere behind him, a little girl in a purple jacket waved goodbye, believing in a world where people listened, where asking for help was brave, and where men with rough hands and scarred knuckles could be heroes. Garrett Wolfe McCrae rode into the sunset carrying that belief with him. And for the first time in 9 years, when he thought about the past, he didn't only see what he'd lost. He saw what he'd found, a second chance. Not to undo the past, but to honor it by doing better in the present. The storm had passed, the road was clear, and somewhere ahead in all the miles yet to come, there would be other nights, other storms, other silent signals waiting to be heard. Garrett would be ready, because he'd learned that the bravest thing a person could do wasn't to face danger without fear. It was to see someone in trouble and refuse to look away, to believe a child when no words were spoken, to answer a call for help even when it came in silence. That was the lesson Ruby had taught him. That was the gift she'd given back. And Garrett carried it with him mile after mile as the Wyoming sky stretched wide and endless above him, and the world opened up in all directions, full of possibility and hope and the quiet promise of tomorrow.